Hi, everybody. Welcome. Glad to see people here in person. Yay. And online. Thanks so much for making the time for this really interesting and helpful presentation. So I'm Tricia Brown, co-director of Great Lakes Biomimicry. The other co-director, Carol Thaler, is out of town right now and couldn't join us, but I know she's with us in spirit. So we're going to be talking about the rapidly changing environment of reporting and expectations for companies when it comes to ESG. There seems to be a real mixed bag out there lately. Carol and I noticed, just scanning and reading that there's two dichotomy. Well, there's more than two, but one is, companies are into it. They see it as a strategic advantage. And now there's this other side that's like pushing it back, saying maybe we shouldn't be spending so much time and energy here. And so, this is something we all need to understand and get a handle on, and Andrew will help us do that. We'll have question and answers at the end. I will do my best to monitor the chat. If the online audience could make sure that they have muted themselves, we'll get started with Andrew. Andrew is the president and founder and launched Blue CSR strategies in 2020. And he leads client engagements to support positive ESG impacts. His work includes helping organizations understand what matters most. And that's really why we're here today, is to talk about that, to help you set a strategy in a framework. Blue CSR serves as an extension to many internal ESG teams and companies, both large and small. And prior to launching Blue CSR, Andrew held leadership positions in both public and private sector organizations, including Gojo Industries, KeyBank, Brown Flynn, which is now an ERM company, and the city of Cleveland, Ohio, which is where I got to know Andrew with SC 2019 a million years ago. His responsibilities included sustainability, corporate responsibility, communications, diversity and inclusion, and community and governmental affairs. With that, Andrew, tell us what you know.
All right, thank you. And thanks to those that are online, and it's great to see people in the room here. So as Tricia mentioned, we're going to spend a little bit of time today, going on a little bit of a journey, actually. I don't know where people are coming into this conversation with understanding of sustainability and ESG, so we'll have a little bit of definitions and groundwork, and then a little bit of a history lesson on like how we got here. Because I work with a lot of companies, as Tricia had mentioned, that some are champions and are really passionate and interested in using this as a strategic advantage in their business operations. But I also work with organizations that have been requested to participate in sustainability and ESG oftentimes by their customers. Sometimes it might be by a board member, or it's their shareholders. So I want to give some context around sort of how that had started, and then why this matters to private companies, and then how to start to do that, or customer alignment. Looks like there's a little bit of formatting issue with the PowerPoint. So just again, a little more about us. I've been in the space for now 20 years, which is kind of scary, leading sustainability efforts. I launched Blue CSR, as Tricia mentioned, 2020. And we do a lot of strategy work. We do a lot of engagement work, and disclosures and reporting for organizations, both about publicly traded companies as well as private companies. Generally, most of our companies and organizations we work with are working with other businesses. We don't have a ton of clients that are B2C customers. Most of our clients are B2B businesses. We're located here in Cleveland, Ohio, and are fast growing. So excited about that. So I mentioned I wanted to hit on some definitions. So in ESG, sustainability, corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility, they're all really trying to tackle much of the same thing, but they're organized differently. They're trying to manage and develop a good structure and governance of managing your non-financial performance that will likely have high probability of having impacts on your financial performance or your reputation or ability to do business. So ESG is the most recent one. Of course, right now it's sort of, as Tricia had kind of alluded to, it's also somewhat under attack. I would say every one of these terminologies have been politicized at one point in time. So what are we doing when we're talking about ESG? It's managing your environmental impacts of the organization, but it's throughout the entire value chain. So it's not within the organizational boundaries or operational control of your organization. So it's thinking about both up and down the value chain. These are things like greenhouse gas emissions, water, waste, energy, all of those types of environmental impacts, biodiversity, et cetera. Social is, again, managing your social impacts and of both yourself, your suppliers, and the potential impacts of the customers that are using your products and services. And this is pretty broad because it's inclusive of safety, human rights, DEI, data privacy and security, ethical behavior. So it's not just thinking about sort of what are my direct environmental impacts or direct employee impacts, but thinking more broadly. And then with governance, these are broadly the governance policies managing your operations of your organization, and how your board committees, senior leadership of organizations are engaged on these topics. So what sustainability is somewhat different, in that it's managing the same things, but it has a different frame of reference. So with sustainability, you're thinking about the environmental and social impacts, but then that third pillar is economic impact. And there's an assumption that you have, so the governance has dropped off, but the governance is there's an assumption that you have good governance to manage the impacts and outputs of these environmental social impacts that will in turn have a positive impact on your company. Sustainability has often had a difficult time of breaking out of the environmental pillar of impacts. And so when organizations use sustainability, you get into this trap on occasion of whoever you're speaking to thinking about you're just talking about environmental sustainability. But in reality, you're not. You're speaking about those three pillars. And that's one reason why I argue that that companies kind of shifted to different terminology like corporate social responsibility and environmental social governance, because it has a different a different lens to take when you're communicating and having conversations with stakeholders that may not be familiar, with this terminology. And then I did want to talk about DEI, or diversity, equity, inclusion, because there's a lot of confusion around DEI. A lot of organizations we engage with think of DEI as diversity. They think of it as sort of what is the makeup of our company, both visual and non-visual differences of individuals. But diversity is just one component, and it is the quantitative representation, of the people that work and live and make your company be successful. Equity is different. Equity is providing equal access to resources and opportunities to individuals that are not based on relationship or status. That last part is really important. That is not based on relationship or status. And equity requires a recognition of historical and institutional inequalities. So equity is quite probably the most difficult thing to bring and incorporate into an organization, because it really is thinking about it's not just equal, you have to create an equitable framework and platform for all of your employees to succeed. And then inclusion is where I often recommend people start, because inclusion is really about creating an environment and practices and behaviors where individuals feel welcomed and understood. And that requires, you're not going to create an inclusive environment without creating psychological and physical safety and trust. If your employees and stakeholders don't trust you and don't feel safe, then they're not going to feel included in the conversation or included in the success. This can be your customers, this can be your employees, it can be your shareholders. The inclusion is an important component of sort of how do you create the environment for success. So I know that that's maybe not what we came here to talk about today, but I wanted to give my definitions that through research of how we sort of approach some of this work. So now the history lesson. This next slide is really, really, really busy. I'm not going to be reading through all of it, but it's a bit of a history lesson around sort of back in the 90s when I was in high school. All right, we had a focus that the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. There was a lot of conversations around how do we manage climate change across geographic boundaries in different jurisdictions around the world. You can take a similar timeline and just talk about the topic of human rights, labor and human rights, and find different data points throughout these 30 some years. But the important part was that large multinational companies and large multinational NGOs needed to start to develop frameworks and systems that worked across geographic boundaries and multi-jurisdictions or regulations. So that's sort of why I kind of highlight the Kyoto Protocol. Of course, we've had COP, now most recently 28 that are revisiting that. I highlight the Paris Climate Accord of 2015 is that next kind of time frame where we really started to set ambitious international targets around climate change. But along the way here, we had different frameworks and NGOs that have been developing ways of both communicating and organizing sustainability initiatives to advance sort of good, responsible business practices along the way. Where as an organization, my organization works with a lot of publicly traded companies. And why I mentioned that the importance of that is that a lot of publicly traded companies are now driving activities in private companies that do business with those companies. So starting in 2016, Larry Fink, who is the CEO of BlackRock, started writing letters to the companies that they invest in. They're the largest investor in the world, saying you need to start to manage your non-financial performance better and start telling us what you're doing. They talked a lot about diversity on the board and the leadership teams. And then they started really talking about climate change. That was instrumental in sort of shifting the conversation from where those of us that are sustainability practitioners often trying to focus on, hey, we can do this stuff and it's going to save us money or increase revenue, to hey, we're not going to invest in your company unless you're managing these topics well. And then when I was at KeyBank in 2018, and that's when ISS, which is the Institutional Shareholder Services Organization, which had longstanding had a governance quality score where they assess companies on the strength of their governance structure. They added environmental and social quality scores that all of a sudden investor relations within publicly traded companies were seeing just right alongside their governance score, this little E and S score. And for Key, it was another 242 different indicators that we needed to manage and measure to respond to. And it really shifted or elevated the conversation around sustainability, I believe, from management level to executive management. And then the pandemic caused a tremendous amount of disruption that really drew focus around some of these other issues: supply chain disruptions, massive social change disruptions, and a real recognition and a building of awareness that climate change is something we can't avoid. So those three things really caused a significant amount of, wait a minute, we got to manage these issues, and elevated and escalated a focus around environmental and social impacts. And then finally, it was 2 years ago when the SEC announced that they were going to have rules around reporting on climate change. And finally, this March, they came out with their rules on what information publicly traded companies have to include in their financial documents and disclosures to SEC. So I mention all that because there's this growth of investment, and there's this growth of attention, and that's sort of translating from companies that that have to disclose to their shareholders information to companies that are doing business with them. This is just some data points around the increase of kind of ESG investing. There's increased understanding and the business case for sustainability and ESG. Companies are recognizing much more that reduces risk, improves operating performance, can eliminate environmental harm, and a lot of other important kind of data points. On the I guess it's the right side of the screen, we have sort of a survey in 2020, and then more recently another survey, just sort of showing a kind of overwhelming influence that now companies are looking at from a sustainability and ESG performance as part of decision making within their organizations. And then kind of a rapid acceleration or increased sense of environmental, social, and governance prioritization, that making sure that companies are disclosing their impacts beyond their financial impacts. Again, a recognition that non-financial performance and good governance are leading indicators for future financial performance. On the right side, when I have sort of a proliferation of frameworks, which I get into a little bit more, a reiteration or declaration of some bold goals, which I'll speak to in greater detail in a few minutes, and an elevated importance of how products and services are sort of advancing a more sustainable and equitable society.
Wait, I just, quick question. How far does the data go back that you were just talking about? Just to 22 or further?
Oh, this previous slide?
Yeah.
2020 is some of that data. 2022 are kind of those bottom indicators. And then this most recent one is as recent as I think it was 2023.
Like you would say 2020 is your baseline for all this?
Well, I would say I update this often, so I don't include data points that are like in the 10s to 2010 to 2020. I just find you can grab data points back, particularly I would say from like 2013 on. There's a ton of business cases. Harvard Business School has done a ton of research on this that we could capture. But I just try to, I'm just citing some more recent data.
Just curious. I like history too, so.
I appreciate the question. So I've been, alluding to this, but so why does this, why does this matter to private companies? And it matters because it's what that like history lesson that I gave you about from, the mid 90s through now, the early 2020s, is that, you have these companies that, some of them believe in this, some of them may not, but they're being forced to sort of show and demonstrate progress by whatever stakeholders have sort of called them to task on that. But why that shift? And I had mentioned sort of in the definitions that we're not interested in just what your direct operational impacts are, but sort of what your impacts are, what products you put out in the world, and then who you're partnering with to be successful. So, with this, there's been a bit of a paradigm shift. So, large companies that are, managing and addressing regulations, both here in the United States, but also internationally, and particularly in Europe, the regulations are pretty strict. And so there's a lot of disclosures and organizational governance frameworks that these companies have to comply with. In the United States, most recently, there's been a fair amount of regulation out in California advancing a lot of these topics. So it's easiest and best for these companies to just set that as the bar for them, and then organize around that. So regulations is a component. Investors is another significant component with the rapid growth of ESG investing and environmental and social aspects of, and there's a lot of data to the person in the back of the room around the performance of ESG focused stocks and non-ESG focused stocks.
Well, by the way, just an FYI.
So that's translating to sort of new partner requirements, and thinking about sort of what are the requirements for the largest companies in the world, or do business with the largest companies in the world. And these are impacting supply chain partners within their ecosystem. I mentioned it a little bit ago, but the other huge aspect is sort of these climate commitments that companies are making. So Now, over 5,000 companies have set what are called science-based targets, and they're members of what's called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And I'll talk about more of that, what that means. But essentially, that means that if you're doing business with a company that has a science-based target, at some point they're going to be inviting you to participate in their target, because you're part of their goal. And increasing in disclosures, companies are also sort of participating and being more transparent about their activities and their impacts, both environmentally and socially. So, who are some of these companies that had set science-based or carbon neutral net zero targets? This is just a small little listing of some that are pretty familiar names. I could add Boeing to this. Boeing has net zero targets as well by 2050. United Airlines has targets. So you're not, if you're a publicly traded company, you have a large market cap, you're not avoiding this. And if you're doing business with these companies, it's likely that if they haven't already, they will be contacting you to understand what your targets are. I'm a believer in the value that sustainability brings to companies, but the stick works too. So that this is a non-regulated issue for many, but it is an issue that the largest companies in the world have decided that they need to take on, in large part to mitigate the risk related to climate change, supply chain disruptions, and human rights. And how those impacts filter to their customers. So what is that? Why is climate change and setting these targets kind of impactful to companies that are engaged in this space? So how many people are sort of familiar with Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions? We've got a few hands up. So Scope 1 emissions are burned emissions. So in a household or office building, that's generally natural gas, but it's also your fleet. If you have a fleet, if you're an airline, it's all your planes. It's burned emissions within your operations. And some companies have a lot of Scope 1 emissions, and manufacturers, for instance, and transportation related organizations, and other companies have zero Scope 1 emissions. But that's sort of burned on site, something that you are contributing, or you are creating the greenhouse gas emissions within your own operations. It also can be refrigerants, it can be methane. It's not just carbon emissions, but it's sort of all your greenhouse gas emissions, but direct. Scope 2 is purchased. So principally that's electricity. That's someone is generating emissions to provide you a commodity like electricity. In addition to, for the vast majority, it's electricity, but it could also be like purchased steam. So if you're buying steam from a central power utility, that is their Scope 1 emission and your Scope 2 emissions. Almost all emissions, like a lot of emissions, all kind of land in Scope 1 or 2, but it's sort of company operations. However, most companies and organizations, most of their emissions are actually, when you look outside of the operational boundary of the company, are Scope 3 emissions. And that's emissions. So upstream, that's sort of everything related to employee commuting, business travel, leased assets, transportation of goods and services to your operations to then create your products. All that activity that is part of your supply chain is, and it could be someone else's Scope 1 or Scope 2 emissions, but it's your Scope 3 emissions, and it's your upstream assets. There's 15 different categories of Scope 3 emissions, and a bunch of them are in that upstream, and then a bunch are in the downstream. And downstream are the transportation of putting your goods or services out into the world, the use and disposal and or reuse of the products that you are producing, and the use that your customers are using for the products that you're producing. So let me think. I don't know the best example, but this is Apple's Scope 3 emission of sending this phone to me people can see this online. And you know, in my use of it is also their scope 3 emissions. Where it gets really complicated is that it's clear there can be the opportunity for double and even triple counting, because you know the electricity that I use to use this Apple phone is my scope 2 emission because it's electricity. But regardless, is that companies now, if they made those science-based targets and they said, oh, we're going to get to net zero, they need to account for, if you're supplying goods and services to them, they need to account for the emissions that you produce. And if they're truly going to get net zero, you also have to get to net zero. And the only way around it is that they have to pay their way out of it. So the only way around it is to buy carbon offsets, or to buy, you know, renewable energy credits or some other mitigation efforts that are going to get rid of those emissions.
Installing solar panels across your facility be a way to do that? Or are you guys figuring the installation and the creation of the solar panels within that whole process as well? Like,
yes,
where does it stop?
It's the answer is complicated because most likely if you're installing solar panels on your facility, what you're trying to do is eliminate your scope 2 emissions by offsetting power that you would purchase out in the grid to using power on site. There's a lot of different, now the dairy industry, is looking at mitigation, methane capture and energy generation to get rid of their scope 3 emissions and help farmers get rid of their scope 1 emissions, which is the cows, right? But there's a lot of different mitigation efforts. And the other kind of challenge with this is that we don't know, for the most part, we don't necessarily have a really clear vision of a direct line pathway to net zero. So there's a lot of kind of embedded understanding around that. We need an innovation in order to get there. I mean, this might be just reiterating or hitting this hammer over this, but when companies meet net zero commitments, it includes their entire supply chain. It really requires companies to improve their management and reporting tools, be able to respond to supplier assessments, and increase transparency with their partners, and also engage with their own supply chains in a similar manner. Because if you said, okay, we're going to also be along the way to meet net zero, then oh boy, now your supply chain's part of that ecosystem. So things that you might want to start to think about as you try to tackle this is think about establishing sustainability programs and setting some goals yourself, responding to, beyond maybe direct customer surveys, responding to some reputable platforms for disclosing your information. And then, be part of the solution by developing products and services that help your customers achieve their goals. And that's sort of the innovation aspect of this. Those are some activities. I'm going to get into a little more detail, given the time, on sort of how to begin. But before I get there, I wanted to kind of give a overview of sort of what are these disclosures and reporting frameworks. And wow, is that crazy? These are just a sampling. And as a professional in this space, this is a kind of a proliferation of different frameworks around the world. There has been some consolidation with some. Ironically enough, TCFD, which has really become sort of a important standard. It's Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. That is what the SEC is aligned to. That's what CDP is aligned to. They're now actually folding into another international framework called ISSB. But the methodology behind TCFD is remaining consistent. So those are the frameworks, like up in that upper left corner. ISO, CDP, EcoVadis. These are all sort of different frameworks for sustainability and good management. Then you have goals and protocols. These are different organizations and frameworks sort of focused on what types of goals should we be setting. There's ratings and indices. These are the organizations that are out there, whether for every one of these cases are assessing you whether you respond or not, if you're a public company. And in some cases, even if you're not a public company. And then regulations, and guidelines, which are evolving and are geographically bound, by regulatory frameworks and national and their state or frameworks. And so companies are responding to and trying to be proactive with managing kind of this landscape. I'm going to spend a couple minutes on what some of these disclosures are. So where do I find these things? I find these disclosures and company information, and either through publicly sourced information for the most part. But these often are found on companies' websites, in their ESG or sustainability reports, which even if you're not a public company, I encourage organizations to communicate what they're doing, in public platforms like your website, and or in information and materials that you're providing to your employees, to your customers, because it's a good way of demonstrating about what you're doing in this space. But we also have surveys, supplier surveys, as well as things like CDP. CDP used to be called the Carbon Disclosure Project. It now is more broadly a reporting platform and a scoring mechanism for companies to respond on climate, forest, water security, and supply chain impacts. Most organizations that are participating in CDP are participating through the climate impact area, but a customer or a company could invite you to participate in that supply chain impact. So what that customer, like a Bayer of the world, might ask, or Home Depot might ask their suppliers to participate in the supplier portal to articulate what the carbon-related impacts are of them doing business with you. And so it's generally tied to the sales and the products and services that you're providing to them, and they're kind of requesting information around what their climate impacts are. They could also ask about water or forest impacts in the same manner. This is so with companies think about investing in some of these areas. It's not really cheap to do a CDP response, and it's a lot of effort and work. And one sort of I guess it's a great framework. I think it's a really great platform. But if a company asks you to participate in CDP, just like any one of these frameworks that we talk about, once you participate, once you're in the system, you're going to be scored every year. So as a company thinks about where to apply resources, I always recommend apply resources where make sure that you understand that whatever you're doing, you have now volunteered your company to participate every year. And if you don't respond, you get grades here. So from A to F. And if you don't respond, you're going to get an F. And as far as I know, there's no way to get off that list. So I haven't found a way yet. Need a better attorney, maybe. So then there's a whole bunch of ratings and rankings and supplier surveys out there as well. One of the really common ones is EcoVadis. Now, full disclosure, my company's an EcoVadis training partner, so we're an approved training partner of EcoVadis. Doesn't mean that we don't get paid by them. We're not marketing with them or anything like that. But we do work with a lot of companies to respond to an EcoVadis survey if their customer has asked them to participate, and we educate people around what this is. But EcoVadis it's an evidence-based system that looks at 4 different pillars of environment, labor and human rights, ethics, and sustainable procurement. And it asks you to provide evidence on what you're doing to manage those impacts. It is widely used. There are over 130,000 companies have been assessed by EcoVadis and participate in their platform. So it's pretty widely used. It's global. Then one couple things I like about it is that one, it's evidence-based. So you have to provide evidence. You can't just say, oh, hey, we're doing this. It is private. So the information you're providing to them, they're not sharing with your customers. They're just using that to, validate the claim that you've made. And it's industry specific and it's scalable. So if you're small, my company's super small, we participate in EcoVadis. So for our questionnaire is quite a bit different than Ford Motor Company's questionnaire. So those are some aspects about it. This is just sort of what they're focused on or what they're looking at. So they look at in those different columns, you have to demonstrate or show what policies you have, what measures you're taking on, what actions, if you have any certifications in that, and they really like ISO. So ISO 9001, ISO 14001 for environment, ISO, oh gosh, it's like 47001 for ethics and cybersecurity. So there's a bunch of different sort of areas that you can look at that. And then your KPIs. So what are your metrics that you're measuring and what frequency you're measuring that on? So I know this is like drinking by the fire hose. So now the final aspect that I wanted to share with you guys today is sort of where to start or how to think about aligning with your customer priorities. And the way that I'm speaking about this is also a good process for actually establishing a sustainability or ESG program within your company more broadly. But like a lighter version of what I'm describing could also be used to help, very strategically sort of identify what are your customers focused on and how might you help them along the way. So the roadmap for this is really really important, and something we say to everyone that we work with is to do what's called a materiality assessment, which helps you understand what are the most important environmental, social, and governance impacts for your organization based on who you work with, what type of business you are, your employee population, your geography, a whole bunch of categories kind of go into establishing a materiality assessment. And then you can decide on how to do 2 and 3, but then getting comfortable with how you talk about this and disclose this information internally and externally, and then developing a management structure around managing those impact areas, and continuing to shape your kind of ESG and sustainability strategy. So what is a materiality assessment? So materiality assessment, is it evidence-based, objective process? They're very hard to do internally. So companies like myself do these assessments. And why I say that is that it's too easy to have biased outputs if you do this internally. Because people, if you're the sustainability lead or you're the CEO and you're trying to interview internal people, they more likely would probably tell you what you want to hear rather than what they're honestly trying to, what they see. But we do a lot of research. It's in 3 main phases, and we do a ton of research. So researching internal, researching understanding kind of what the business is, what its impact opportunities areas are, and researching competitors, customers, suppliers, and then also international frameworks, including importantly is like SASB, the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, has sustainable impact areas that would likely have a material financial impact on a company's performance. They will be a very narrow list of topics. And then from that, we have a big list of sort of a whole bunch of different topics in E, S, and G, and we do stakeholder engagement to kind of validate those, the information that we've perceived, and ultimately the goal is in that 3rd phase, which is to prioritize those topics and get them down to sort of a manageable list of information that you have. A materiality assessment is really helpful with sort of thinking about this, and aligning and or defending how you are addressing these topics with your customers. Because if you are providing a product or service to a company that's then taking that product and adding value to it, or, so like the components, and I keep bringing up my iPhone, but if you're providing like components into the iPhone, but Apple's producing the iPhone and sending it on the world, you might have a different set of material issues than Apple has. So when you have this assessment, you can say, we know that's important to you, but we only operate in the United States, or we're only doing this part of this, so we're not tracking that right now because it's just we don't have the resources to track that, and hopefully they'll understand that. They don't always do that though. But that's helpful. It's a good way of kind of setting the groundwork for managing these topics. Almost done. So the other sort of like, how do you manage these issues? So it's really important to kind of develop a strategy based on sort of your materiality assessment. So what strategy are we going to go to market with? What approach are we going to take internally with our operations? And then as you develop that strategy, you got to build what policies are we going to develop? What's our governance structure to actually execute on the strategy? And then, what programs are we going to implement to make progress on that? So, really simple. I go into more detail here, but really simple ways of sort of framing this in a manageable way of moving forward with, okay, we know what our topics are. Now, how are we going to actually manage these topics? What policies we need in place? And then what programs are we going to implement in order to achieve our goals? All this is iterative, and it's I consider like any of these things like living documents, because a lot of questions sometimes we get with companies that we work with, our clients, is what happens if our business operations change? What happens if we make an acquisition? What happens with if we are entering into a new market? Those are all sort of trigger points to kind of start over again and think about, all right, well, what are the issues that we need to be addressing now? And then, what goals should we have in place? Policies we need to manage these, and programs to be effective. So that's kind of the best I can do with sort of helping to frame how people can start with this. A really helpful way of working with your customers is to start to integrate these topics or these conversations into your regular business review meetings. Go into those meetings knowledgeable about whatever information you can find about them, and then demonstrate how you can help them kind of achieve their own goals. So with that, I'll go to discussion and questions. I don't know if there's questions online, and yeah. Yes.
Question. So do you find that folks running a quality program with an ISO program that aligns very nicely with folding in kind of an ESG strategy on top of that, like layering it and have it be allied? Because obviously quality big tenets are like continual improvement and identifying nonconformities, or these places where you acquire a different company, it changes the scope of how that's managed. So do those things align nicely, and do you see the same responsible parties being involved in those?
Yeah. So the question for those on the phone, I don't know if they can they capture. So I'll just repeat it briefly. So the question was whether frameworks like ISO is a good framework or supportive of organization sustainability initiatives. I think summarizing it, but and yes, they are. But they're as you know, their ISO is also pretty rigorous. So not all companies can take on an ISO certification. But they are a really good framework for, I'd say, they're managing sort of those individual buckets that ISO is sort of strategically focused on. So, 9001 being really focused on labor practices and safe working conditions, 14,001 on kind of environmental impact. So one's not going to capture everything. And whereas, yeah, and that quite frankly, there's nothing out there right now that sort of is like captured everything. But that's why some of these supply chain engagement tools like EcoVadis or SAQ and others are formed, because then they can layer in, they can say, oh, that company's ISO certified. in X, and that will give validation that they're managing their operations sufficiently. Sometimes they also layer in, okay, you might have ISO certification, but you only have it at, one of your facilities, and you have 45 facilities, that you'll get kind of discounted in their scoring methodology for that. All these platforms have scoring methodologies. They all have a scoring methodology that's usually in a black box, so you don't get clear line of sight on it. Or like EcoVadis does provide some transparency on how they score and how they're weighted. So labor and human rights is for most industries, the most heavily weighted sector or pillar of those four. And then, you get a score of, most companies don't get a badge, but you get like everything else, bronze, silver, gold, and platinum on your scoring. And that's sort of how they manage it.
I guess I've been around this space for a very long time. I've watched the changes with solid waste and green build. So when you look off into the future with what's going on today, what do you see? Are they shrinking? And is there going to be 3 or 4 worldwide frameworks?
Yeah.
Is it going to be easier for companies to do? All of this has been painful growth all along.
Right.
And, we've gone from the term global warming, climate change, and a bunch of other things. So where do you see this heading?
So I see it heading, I see some consolidation of frameworks, but like any self-serving organization, consolidation is sort of means merger, which means they're not their own anymore, and so I somewhat skeptical of massive consolidation of these frameworks. In addition, there's a massive gap between where some of the leader countries are and then like the United States, where those frameworks are getting more rigorous. If they're European aligned, they're rapidly getting more rigorous, and the burden on companies to be transparent is rapidly increasing. I'd say more broadly speaking, I think what I was interested with the SEC in announcing these rules and regulations, in some ways I thought that it's just the SEC trying to keep up with sort of some other exchanges. So in some ways, regulation in some ways becomes irrelevant if companies are being held accountable for the public statements that they are making. But they're voluntary statements, right? So they have to be held accountable by the stakeholders that they have said they're going to make these commitments to. Some people have revised their goals. Some people have, rolled back on their net zero commitments. But it's also that there's this disparity between what the truists, I call them, the academic truists of, and also scientists of like where we actually need to be and how quickly, and how actually practical it's going to be to get there and what mechanisms are going to use to get there. One example that I put on that is there was a lot of pressure for financial services companies, so banks, to report and disclose their financed emissions, and that's still there's still a lot of pressure there. But in some instances, we would say it's without any clarity and methodology about how to go about doing that. So you could spend millions and millions of dollars, calculating that, and likely double or triple counting those emissions, because obviously other banks are financing similar things. And when we could be using it to finance projects that would reduce global emissions. So, there's that tension of wanting information and get data, and then the urgency of getting things done, and then sort of the people that are in the trenches of actually trying to do this, and then the organizations that are trying to find the perfect framework for us to respond to.
We have a question from online. I'm an engineering professor and would like to ask, since the sustainability landscape is continuing to evolve and there are so many frameworks, protocols, regulations, et cetera, what do you think undergraduates need to know about sustainability to be better prepared to work with these concepts after graduation? Thank you, Jacqueline.
Yeah, I think any class that I ever speak to, well, when oftentimes when they're like, oh, I want to get a sustainability job after school, I say, well, really don't look for a job title that says sustainability in it. Only those jobs are out there and they're great, but they're also very few and far between. And whereas if you're an engineer and you are interested and passionate about sustainability, then find an organization that's doing this work or that can have a really positive impact, and then be that subject matter expert in your field of expertise. So what I say to undergraduates is that be the best at what you're getting your degree in, and then apply a broad mindset of sustainability to that. If you're a sustainability major, you're getting a skill set that are being trained up to be sort of think through like network thinking, or thinking across impacts of different individual skill sets, and then that's the skill set that you're bringing to the table, is sort of understanding, we used to call it like looking across the silos, being that inquisitive person they're trying to understand how we can do better within an organization. You could very well move into operational excellence by doing that, or as a core component. Sometimes I'd get a comment from a colleague, because as Tricia had mentioned, I've worked both a lot of the time as an internal champion on sustainability. I'll get the comment, stay in your lane, like, and I'm like, what lane is that? So that's generally was my response, but that's sort of, I don't know if I totally answered the question, but just trying to make sure that you're providing that interest in sustainability to the job that you've been tasked to do.
Okay. She said, thank you. So,
Okay. I got it close enough. Yeah. We have a few more minutes. Any other questions or discussion? Yeah.
I was wondering if you think that CSRD over in Europe is going to be the known framework over in Europe, or if that's going to come over to the States.
I don't know. So the question was that whether CSRD was going to become the known framework globally and kind of be transferred to the United States. The largest multinational corporations will likely align and are aligning a lot of their reporting and kind of strategy impact around CSRD. So those biggest companies that have a lot of operations globally and have operations in Europe will probably adopt that, and that framework has carried in a lot of different alignments, like TCFDs aligned within it and all of that. So, but I don't think that companies that are operating more narrowly in geographies will adopt some of those frameworks. And it could very well be wrong, but just simply because it's pretty onerous to kind of meet some of those standards, and not a lot of organizations have the resources to invest in kind of getting there. As a subset of that, though, TCFD, with now being in the language of both California regulations and the SEC regulations, will most likely be a much more probable framework, particularly for US-based companies, to align to with talking about their climate change impacts. So however that lives on, and since the website's now static, however that evolves and lives on, and whichever framework that kind of continues to get folded into will likely be, in my opinion, is the more dominant framework.
Okay, we have a comment. My microphone stopped working. Comment to the previous question from Alyssa Bean. She said, I went to school for business management and started in supply chain at Lubrizol, showed an interest in sustainability, and volunteered for some sustainability activities and landed a position as a sustainability specialist, which I've been doing since 2021 now. So
Awesome. That's
There
a
you
great,
go.
great testament.
yeah. I've got a question.
Yes.
I think about accounting and accounting standards when we talk about all this, and you touched on it really briefly with FASB and stuff. Is the accounting profession evolving to a rate where they can be helpful in helping companies quantify and report these numbers?
I think that I spoke on a panel about engaging your finance department on your sustainability initiatives. I think that accounting standards, accounting, the rigor behind financial accounting, and some of the expertise that accountants have are really great addition to working in this space. They're working with information that's different, but it's data is data. You know, the frequency of the data is different, the quality of the data is different. But I think that there's a lot of application of accounting principles and people that are good accountants will helping to level up or bring up the management rigor that's currently really lacking around environmental and social data points that could have a material impact on it. I think that the big four accounting firms are investing exponentially in sustainability and ESG consulting. So they have a ton of investment in sustainability consulting to provide that consulting support to their customers, like they do with the accounting support. One of the big challenges with some of the commitments that they have made over the last 4 or 5 years is that there aren't enough people that are experts in sustainability to fill the roles that they need or that they've made commitments to. That's again, I'm sure they'll do it. I think PwC said they're going to hire 100,000 sustainability professionals in the next 5 years or something. Don't quote me, PwC, but anyways, I think that they are going to be an important part of the puzzle, particularly when we talk about reporting and financial reports.
Okay, great. Any more questions in the house, online?
No, but I have a shameless plug. I've never had to do these before.
Go ahead.
So I started a farm in Ottawa County, and I just declared my Lakewood property a farm. So if you guys want locally grown produce or herbs in your food service locations, please let me know. The farm is Red Clay Farm, and you can find us on Facebook as well as Red Clay Farm at outlook.com. So there's my shameless plug.
Shameless plug for good food. There's nothing wrong with that.
All right, we all help me thanking Andrew for coming and giving us such great information. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.